Son betrays his father, firing him without a second thought. But when the truth surfaced, he realized some mistakes can never be undone. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the towering city skyline, but inside a luxurious high-rise office, the air was thick with tension. A decision was about to be made, one that would change everything. At the heart of it all stood Richard Carter, a man who had spent the last 40 years building his company from the ground up. His once strong hands, now worn with age, bore the marks of years of sacrifice. He had poured his blood, sweat, and sleepless nights into this empire. Every late night at the office, every missed family dinner, every difficult decision, he had made them all so that his legacy would stand tall. Yet, standing before him now was his own son, Ethan Carter, the man who was about to tear it all away. Ethan was young, ambitious, and ruthless in his pursuit of success. To him, business was about results, fast, efficient, and without sentiment. He had grown up watching his father run the company, but he saw Richard's methods as outdated, slow, and a hindrance to progress. Ethan had big plans, and there was no room for the past in the future he envisioned. For weeks, Ethan had debated this decision. The board had whispered in his ear, convincing him that his father's leadership was holding the company back. Investors wanted fresh leadership. Change was necessary. Ethan had spent countless nights justifying his choice, telling himself that this was not personal, it was just business. But now, as he stood in his father's office, looking at the man who had built everything, the weight of what he was about to do felt heavier than ever. Richard sat behind his massive wooden desk, his expression unreadable. The office, once a place filled with warmth and wisdom, now felt cold. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice steady but lacking its usual confidence. "It is time." Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. He had seen this coming. The closed-door meetings, the sudden shift in company decisions. He was not blind. But hearing the words from his own son still stung in a way he had not expected. "You have worked hard, but the company needs a new direction," Ethan continued. "I have spoken with the board. They all agree. It is time for a change." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. He simply studied his son, the same boy he had once carried on his shoulders, the boy he had stayed up late helping with school projects, the boy who had once looked up to him with admiration. Now, that boy had become a man who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle. "So, this is it," Richard finally said, his voice calm. "You are firing me." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He had rehearsed this conversation in his head countless times, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of it. "It is not like that, Dad," Ethan said quickly. "You can still be involved in some way. But I need full control. I need to take this company forward." Richard let out a small, humorless laugh. "Full control. That is what this is really about, is it not?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "You built something great, but I can make it better. The world is changing and we have to change with it." Richard slowly stood up, his presence still commanding despite his age. He walked over to the large floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the city he had helped shape. "I built this company with more than just numbers and strategies," he said. "I built it with people, with trust, with years of relationships that a spreadsheet cannot measure." Ethan sighed. "And that is why we are falling behind. The market does not care about feelings, Dad. It cares about results." Richard turned to face him, his sharp eyes filled with something Ethan could not quite read. Then, with a slow nod, he walked to his desk, reached into a drawer, and pulled out a small, worn-out notebook. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Ethan. "What is this?" Ethan asked, confused. Richard's eyes held a sadness Ethan had never seen before. "It is everything I know. Every lesson. Every mistake. Every piece of advice I could ever give you. Since you believe you no longer need me, maybe this will help." Ethan hesitated before picking up the notebook. It felt heavier than it should have. Richard exhaled and straightened his posture. "I will not fight you, son. If this is what you truly believe is best, then I will step aside." Ethan nodded, relieved that there would be no drawn-out battle. "I appreciate that, Dad. I really do." But as Richard walked past him toward the door, he paused. Without looking back, he said, "Be careful, Ethan. Success built on betrayal never lasts." And with that, he walked out of the office, the company, his legacy, leaving behind a silence that Ethan could not shake. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in Ethan's mind. But he pushed it away. He had done what needed to be done. Or so he thought. Ethan watched his father leave, a strange tightness forming in his chest. He shook it off. This was the price of leadership. He had done what had to be done. He sat down at his father's desk, his desk now, and looked around. It should have felt like a victory, but something was missing. The room felt emptier. His assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Carter, the board is ready for you." Ethan straightened his tie, pushing away any lingering hesitation. "I will be there in a moment." As he stood up, his eyes fell on the old notebook his father had left behind. He picked it up, flipping through its pages. Scribbled notes, reminders, business principles. It was his father's wisdom, everything he had learned over decades. For a moment, Ethan considered tossing it aside. But something made him hold on to it. He slipped the notebook into his briefcase and walked toward the boardroom, unaware that this decision would come back to haunt him in ways he never imagined. Because Richard Carter was not just walking away. He was about to teach his son a lesson he would never forget. Richard Carter sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the empty dining table. The silence was deafening. Just weeks ago, his days had been filled with purpose, running a company, making decisions, mentoring young executives. Now that life was gone. The company he built was no longer his. The moment he walked out of that office, he had told himself he would not let it break him. He was not a weak man. He had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was betrayal, not from a stranger, not from a competitor, but from his own son. Still, he refused to wallow in bitterness. He had always believed in moving forward, no matter how difficult the road. But as the days passed, he found himself lost in a world that no longer needed him. His routine was gone. His purpose was stripped away. One evening, as he sat in his dimly lit apartment, his old friend Henry, a retired businessman, stopped by. Henry had heard what happened. "So, what now?" Henry asked as they sat by the window, drinking coffee. Richard gave a small, tired smile. "I am still figuring that out." Henry sighed. "You spent your whole life building something, and now it is taken away. Does he even check on you?" Richard hesitated. "No, he does not." Henry shook his head. "You are his father, Richard. Does he even realize what he has done?" Richard looked out at the city. Maybe one day he will. A son without regret, for now. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter was thriving, or at least that was how it appeared. With his father out of the way, he wasted no time in reshaping the company. New strategies, aggressive expansions, bold marketing. He wanted to prove to everyone that he was right. He needed to prove it. At the company's executive meeting, Ethan stood at the head of the long conference table, addressing the board members. "We are entering a new era," he declared confidently. "The old ways are behind us. From now on, we do things differently." The board members nodded in approval. Investors were pleased. Profits had seen an initial surge. To the outside world, Ethan was the visionary leader they had been waiting for. At a celebratory dinner with his closest colleagues, glasses clinked and laughter filled the air. One of Ethan's business partners, Daniel, raised a toast. To Ethan Carter, the man who had the guts to do what others could not. Ethan smirked, raising his glass. He felt untouchable. He had taken control, made the hard decisions, and left behind the baggage of the past. His father? He barely thought about him anymore. Whispers of warning. But not everyone around him agreed with what he had done. One evening, as he walked through the sleek corridors of his company, his longtime assistant, Linda, approached him. "Mr. Carter, may I speak with you for a moment?" she asked hesitantly. Ethan nodded, barely glancing up from his phone. "Make it quick." Linda hesitated before speaking. "It is about your father. I heard he has not been doing well." Ethan's expression hardened. "I do not see how that concerns me." Linda sighed. "You may not now, but one day, you will regret this." Ethan scoffed. "Regret? Linda, my father made his choices. He was not willing to adapt, so he was left behind. That is business." Linda held his gaze for a moment, then simply shook her head. "I just hope you realize before it is too late." Ethan dismissed her words, but for the first time, something unsettled him. A father's quiet struggle. Back at his apartment, Richard found himself struggling more than he admitted. His health had started to decline. His energy was lower, his body ached, and there were days when even getting out of bed felt like a challenge. He had ignored it at first, convincing himself it was just exhaustion, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. One night, as he was walking home from the grocery store, he felt dizzy. The sidewalk beneath him blurred, his chest felt tight, and before he knew it, he was on his knees. A stranger rushed to his side, helping him sit against a bench. "Sir, are you okay?" the young man asked. Richard took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "Yes, just a little tired." The truth was he was not okay, but he had no one to call. No family waiting for him. And for the first time since losing his company, he felt truly alone. A friend's desperate attempt. The next morning, Henry showed up at Richard's door. "You look like hell," Henry said bluntly. Richard chuckled weakly. "Nice to see you too." Henry sighed. "Listen, I have let you sit in this misery long enough. It is time to talk to your son." Richard shook his head. "No. He made his choice. He does not need me anymore." Henry leaned forward. "And what if you do not have much time left?" Richard looked away. He knew Henry was right, but his pride, his disappointment, his heartbreak, it all kept him from reaching out. A son's blind confidence. Meanwhile, Ethan continued climbing higher. At another corporate event, reporters surrounded him, eager for interviews. One of them asked, "Mr. Carter, your leadership has taken this company to new heights. But many still respect your father's legacy. Do you ever seek his guidance?" Ethan forced a smile. "My father was a great businessman, but the world moves forward. I do not believe in looking back." His words made headlines. He was praised for his boldness, his fearless approach. But somewhere, miles away, his father saw that interview on television. And for the first time, he realized his son did not just push him aside. He had erased him completely. The unexpected disappearance. A week later, something unexpected happened. One morning, Henry called Richard, but there was no answer. He called again. Still nothing. Concerned, he decided to check on him. But when he arrived at Richard's apartment, the door was slightly open. Inside, the place looked untouched, as if no one had been there in days. Richard was gone. Henry felt his heart pound. Something was wrong. Where had Richard gone? And did Ethan even care enough to find out? A call that changes everything. At that same moment, Ethan sat in his office, preparing for another big meeting. His secretary walked in, holding a phone. "Sir, you have an urgent call." Ethan barely looked up. "I am busy. Take a message." The secretary hesitated. "Sir, it is about your father." Ethan froze. For the first time in weeks, he felt something he had ignored for too long. He grabbed the phone. "What happened?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the words shook him to his core. "Mr. Carter, your father is missing." Ethan's world stopped. His father, the man he had abandoned, the man he had betrayed, was gone. And suddenly, everything he had built felt meaningless. Because no amount of success could change one simple truth. He might have just lost his father forever. Ethan Carter had always believed he had control over his life. Every decision, every step, calculated, precise, intentional. But now, for the first time, he felt completely powerless. His father was missing. The words kept repeating in his mind as he rushed out of his office. His heart pounded as he dialed every number he could think of. His father's phone went straight to voicemail. He drove straight to his father's apartment, barely remembering how he got there. When he arrived, the place was exactly as Henry had described: empty, abandoned, lifeless. Ethan turned to Henry, his father's oldest friend. "When was the last time you saw him?" Henry's face was lined with worry. "About a week ago." He looked tired. Not himself. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had not spoken to his father in months. He had been too busy, too consumed with his own success to even check in. Now he was gone. Piecing together the truth, Ethan spent the next 2 days searching. He checked hospitals, shelters, old business contacts, anywhere his father could have gone. But no one had seen him. Each dead end tightened the knot in his chest. For the first time, the reality of what he had done truly hit him. He had cast his father aside, assuming he would be fine. But Richard Carter was an old man. A proud man. A man who had lost everything. And Ethan had been too blind to see it. Then, on the third day, Henry called him. "There is someone you need to talk to," Henry said. "Meet me at Westbridge Cafe." Ethan did not hesitate. A stranger's revelation. At the cafe, Ethan found Henry sitting across from a middle-aged woman. She looked at Ethan with a knowing sadness. "This is Margaret," Henry explained. "She works at St. Vincent's Hospice." Ethan's throat went dry. "Hospice?" Margaret nodded. "Your father has been staying there." The words hit him like a brick. "He is sick." Ethan's voice cracked. Margaret hesitated. "It is not my place to say, but yes. And he has been for a while." Ethan felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. "Why did no one tell me?" Margaret's expression softened. "Did you ever ask?" Ethan had no answer. The truth about his father's sacrifices. At St. Vincent's, Ethan sat outside his father's small, quiet room. His hands trembled as he gripped the chair. He was not ready for this. Margaret sat beside him. "Do you know why your father never told you?" she asked gently. Ethan swallowed hard. "Because he did not want me to see him weak." Margaret shook her head. "No. It was because he did not want to burden you." Ethan looked up, confused. Margaret sighed. "Your father knew about his illness before you fired him. He stayed silent because he wanted you to focus on your career. He wanted you to succeed, even if it meant he had to suffer alone." Ethan's chest tightened painfully. Margaret continued, "I have spoken to him many nights. He never blamed you, Ethan. He was proud of you." Ethan's vision blurred. He had spent months believing his father was in his way, a burden to his ambitions. But in reality, his father had been protecting him all along. A son's regret. Ethan finally walked into the room. His father lay in bed, looking smaller than Ethan had ever seen him. His face was pale, his body frail. The man who had once stood tall, who had built a legacy from nothing, was now barely strong enough to sit up. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt ashamed. Richard slowly opened his eyes. "Ethan?" His voice was weak, but there was no anger. No bitterness. Just surprise. Ethan sat beside him. "Dad, why did you not tell me?" Richard gave a faint smile. "Would it have changed anything?" Ethan felt his throat tighten. "Yes, it would have." Richard looked at his son carefully. "You have always been strong-willed, Ethan. I never wanted to hold you back." Ethan shook his head. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." For the first time in years, he reached for his father's hand. And for the first time, his father held on. A race against time. Over the next few days, Ethan did everything he could. He hired the best doctors, arranged for private care, even tried to move his father to a better facility. But money could not buy time. Richard's condition had advanced too far. One night, as Ethan sat beside his father, Richard looked at him with tired eyes. "You cannot fix this, son," he said softly. Ethan refused to accept it. "You're going to get better. I will make sure of it." Richard gave him a sad smile. "Ethan, some things are not meant to be fixed, just understood." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "I do not want to lose you." His father squeezed his hand. "Then do not. Carry me with you. Learn from me. Do better." Ethan's heart ached. He had wasted so much time chasing success, and now, when he was finally ready to fix things, time was running out. The final lesson. One evening, Richard asked Ethan for one last favor. "Take me home," he said. Ethan hesitated. "Are you sure?" Richard nodded. "I do not want to spend my last days in a hospital." Ethan did not argue. He arranged everything, bringing his father back to the home they had once shared. Over the next few days, Ethan stayed by his side, listening to his father's stories, soaking in every moment. One night, as they sat together, Richard looked at his son and said, "I never needed the company, Ethan. I just needed you." Ethan felt tears burn his eyes. He had spent so long proving himself, chasing success, only to realize his father had only ever wanted his presence. Richard Carter closed his eyes that night, with his son beside him, and when the morning came, he was gone. A son's awakening. Ethan stood at his father's funeral, staring at the tombstone. Everything felt hollow. The success, the deals, the money, none of it mattered. Henry stood beside him. "He forgave you, you know." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know, but I do not know if I will ever forgive myself." Henry sighed. "Then do what he asked, do better." Ethan stared at his father's name carved in stone. And in that moment, he made a decision. He would not just remember his father. He would honor him by never making the same mistake again. The final hours. Ethan sat beside his father's bed, his fingers trembling as he held onto Richard's frail hand. The room was silent except for the steady rhythm of his father's slow, shallow breaths. The once strong man who had built an empire from nothing, who had fought through life's toughest challenges, now lay weak and fragile. Ethan had spent the last few weeks doing everything possible, bringing the best doctors, staying by his father's side, trying to make up for lost time. But time was merciless. He knew what was coming, and it was tearing him apart. A heartbreaking confrontation. Richard slowly opened his eyes, his gaze settling on Ethan. "You have been here every day," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan swallowed hard. "Of course I have." Richard gave him a faint smile. "That is funny, because there was a time when you could not wait to be away from me." Ethan felt a deep sting in his chest. His father's words were not cruel, but they carried a truth he could not escape. "I was wrong," Ethan admitted. "I thought pushing you away would make me stronger. That success was all that mattered." Richard took a slow breath. "And now?" Ethan's voice broke. "Now I know that I was a fool." His father's eyes softened. "No, son. You were just lost." Ethan shook his head. "No. I was selfish. I thought I was doing the right thing, but all I did was hurt the one person who gave up everything for me." A weak chuckle escaped Richard's lips. "You are my son, Ethan. I would do it all again." Tears burned in Ethan's eyes. "But I did not deserve it." Richard's grip on his hand tightened slightly. A father's love is not about who deserves it. It just is. Ethan lowered his head, his chest tightening with emotions he could no longer contain. "I should have been there for you," he whispered. "I should have listened. I should have." Richard exhaled slowly. "Ethan, listen to me." Ethan looked up, meeting his father's tired but steady gaze. "This is life," Richard said. "We make choices. Sometimes they are right, sometimes they are wrong. But what matters is what we learn from them." Ethan's throat tightened. "And if it is too late?" His father gave him a long, searching look. "For me, maybe. But for you?" Richard whispered. "You still have time." Ethan's breath hitched. Time for what? To do better. A son's breaking point. That night, Ethan sat alone in the house that once felt too small, too suffocating. Now it felt empty. He stared at the old photographs lining the walls. Pictures of his childhood. Pictures of his father in his younger years. Strong, determined, full of life. Ethan had spent years resenting his father, believing he was an obstacle to his success. But in truth, his father had been his greatest supporter all along. And now he was slipping away. Ethan closed his eyes, pressing his fingers against his temples. The weight of his mistakes was unbearable. The guilt, the shame, the regret, it was suffocating. For the first time in his life, he did not know how to move forward. A final conversation. The next morning, Ethan walked into his father's room and sat by his side. Richard looked weaker than ever. His breathing was slow, his skin pale. Ethan knew this would be their last conversation. "Dad," he said softly, his voice shaking. Richard's tired eyes met his. "Yes, son. I want you to know that I will never forget this. I will never forget what I did." Richard gave him a sad smile. "But, because if you forget, then it means you did not learn." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "I want to fix things." Richard exhaled slowly. "Then promise me something." Ethan leaned in. "Anything. Live your life with love, Ethan. Not with greed. Not with fear. Not with regret. With love." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Promise me," Richard whispered. Ethan gripped his father's hand. "I promise." A faint smile crossed Richard's lips. "That is all I ever wanted to hear." That night, as the house was silent and the world outside continued moving forward, Richard Carter took his last breath. Ethan sat by his side, holding his hand. And for the first time in his life, he truly understood what he had lost. A truth he can never change. The funeral was small, private. Ethan stood at the gravesite, staring at the freshly turned soil. Henry stood beside him. "He was proud of you, you know." Ethan nodded. "I know." Henry sighed. "So what now?" Ethan took a slow breath. Now he had to live with the truth. He fired his own father, believing it was the only way forward. But in the end, he learned the hardest lesson of all. Some mistakes can never be undone, only remembered. The end. Life offers second chances, but only if we take them before it is too late. Do not let regret be your only reminder of what truly matters. Watch till the end and ask yourself, what would you have done? Subscribe now for more powerful stories that make you think. Like, share, and comment. Your thoughts matter.